All right, I turned the recording on. So this will be recorded for all time. No pressure, Olivia. Whenever you are ready to hit the ground running, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Good to see everyone. I'm sorry I haven't been able to see all of the courses, been able to catch up with folks on a couple projects. And today just going to give you a bit of sort of just general on adaptation, talk about the wildlife adaptation menu with a few case studies, and then just talk about generally about frameworks for adaptation. So a couple things. I'm hoping we can be a little bit more interactive. It's always more enjoyable for me, hopefully more enjoyable for you as well. And then we'll all remember more. And two, there might be an emergency on my end where I have to pop out, and Marta Lyons will have to step in for me. So, and so, I didn't give her, there are no notes in my slides, so she would be doing it completely cold. So it's on me. So, yeah, so with that, and again, like, let's make this interactive as much as possible. So my name is Olivia LeDee. I'm the acting director of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is a USGS university partner organization where we do research on the impacts of climate change on natural and coastal resources, with an emphasis on impacts and informing adaptation with the best science in partnership with resource managers. I'm a wildlife ecologist by training, so this is what I like to do and like to talk about. So it's always good fun to look at examples and show pictures of wildlife. So talk about the principles of adaptation, again, the wildlife menu, and then briefly touch on decision making. I mean, these are all things that you could spend a whole semester talking about, right? So, but want to hit some important points and get you comfortable using the wildlife menu in multiple scenarios. I think everyone is probably comfortable and familiar with the concept of climate adaptation. A couple things to point out. Strategic is an important word, right? Where we are thoughtful, we are planned, and active in the decision process. It can be anticipatory, sort of like what you expect to come in terms of changes, or you could be reacting to those changes. And it, again, current or expected effects of climate change. But strategic is a pretty important word here. Sorry, I hear noises. So climate adaptation is local scale, right? It depends on sort of climate, right? Some places are dealing with heavy rainfall events. Some places are dealing with drought, right? So that exposure is really important. Other threats. Some places are large intact areas. Others are dealing with really fragmented systems filled with invasive species. And then the adaptive capacity, how an organism or area will respond to climate will vary widely, right? Their innate ability to respond. Something else to focus on is manager-led, right? So thinking about, remember we talked about strategic, evaluating your goals. You also have expertise. So I would say don't necessarily look to climate scientists or others. There is a lot of expertise on natural history, on the resource, on local threats that is important to bring to bear on the issue, as well as determining what the priorities are. That's the role of the manager. And then is evidence-based, right? So we have a couple decades of climate adaptation science, right? And that keeps accelerating. And so just want to emphasize that this is not necessarily new. It's maybe new to some of our organizations, but there is a lot of information out there. And part of it is that there is too much information out there. And that's one of the reasons why we have the adaptation menu. So I also want to talk about that slide gave me problems. I could not fix it. So just ignore the image all the way on the right. So climate adaptation is not business as usual. And I actually just heard this in a conversation today, like, oh, like we're doing our buffer strips, we're doing X, and that's great for climate. If you're not rethinking sort of where, what, and how you're doing it, again, like being strategic, I would consider that is not So could the same practices and goals be climate adaptation? Yes, but only after you've gone through the process of reevaluating your goals, approaches, and actions. So again, land or population management without reconsideration of goals and approaches is not climate adaptation. And I'm sure someone would debate me about that, but I'm not calling that climate adaptation. So business as usual. There's often confusion. So we're not talking about adaptive capacity either. So whether an organism has the innate ability phenotypically, evolutionarily to respond to changes in climate, that's adaptive capacity. And we're not, so we might benefit from that, and maybe we don't focus on a system because it has considerable adaptive capacity, but it might not be across its entire life history. It might be only one element where it can sort of advance its breeding date, but otherwise might be vulnerable in another system. And then one that people often confuse is not adaptive management. Adaptive management can be a part of adaptation, but adaptive management is really when we're talking about that cycle of making sure you understand your problem, thinking about how you're going to intervene, monitoring, evaluating, and then changing your management practices in response. So this is a simplistic approach to sort of thinking about what are our goals. Typically, you're trying to reduce the exposure or increase the adaptive capacity. So can you provide additional shade or cover or woody debris to reduce sort of thermal stress? Or can you increase genetic diversity to increase adaptive capacity? Or so reducing climate exposure or increasing adaptive capacity, which are the components of climate vulnerability. Or increasing resilience. It's not a term I like to use, but I'm going to use it here as a catch-all. So we might improve how a system's doing by reducing other threats, invasive species, other stressors that don't necessarily have a climate link. You might intervene. And then ultimately, we're looking at maintaining an ecosystem service, right? Presence of it on the landscape for the benefit of people. It's an ecosystem engineer. It provides pollinator services, but trying to think about what are your goals. But sort of typically, the top line goals are reduce exposure and increase adaptive capacity. So there are risks with climate adaptation. And I think that's one thing that we are only starting to talk about a little bit more now, right? Because it's like, well, we have to do something. Well, anytime we intervene in the system, there is risk. And so the important thing is to address those at the outset and sort of plan accordingly. So there might be failure, right? So you might have spent a lot of money or might have diverted your attention from another resource to address this one. And then there's also the concept of maladaptation, which again is something to think about. We're starting to talk about it more, but so you might propagate negative consequences for other components in the system. And this is just to sort of be aware of that and think of that. But I don't want to scare you, right? Because indecision is also a decision too, right? We're all aware. So we do this all of the time. We make decisions on behalf of the resource with management. We are weighing risk, benefits, and cons. So I would argue climate change is not very different than a lot of the work we do. It's just another factor we have to weave in. So as I said, part of the challenge is that there's perhaps too much information, right? Because it's not like here's one study on this tiny little bird, and there's this one study on this amphibian, right? And it's not sort of all pulled together, and no one has time. Researchers don't have time to read all of the papers anymore. So really with the wildlife adaptation menu, we try to consolidate, organize as best as we thought how natural resource managers think with their feedback and evidence-based, based on the best available science, collection of adaptation actions for terrestrial management. Doesn't touch fish systems, but you all are aware of that already. So we looked at a bunch of papers. over 2,100, about 1,300 of those dealt with wildlife. Looked for management recommendations, so over 500, and pulled out 2,300 recommendations. And then we put that into a structure, right? Because there's a lot of overlap, or how can you make sense of it? But so 13 strategies, 80 approaches, and then who knows how many tactics are in there as well. So I'm curious, how, with the show of hands, how comfortable are you getting with the wildlife menu? Show of hands, clapping, whatever. Let's see what I can see. Oh, Stephen Handler. You don't count. Couple. Okay, so less so. Is that maybe someone can unmute and sort of share? Andrew's chuckling. Andrew.
I didn't understand the question.
So how comfortable are you navigating the menu, the wildlife adaptation menu?
Me personally,
Yeah.
I'm having lots of problems.
Yeah.
Because
and can say more.
Okay. My problem is I have a hard time looking at something, and I'm not used to computers for one thing. I'm used to paper in front of me where I can draw all over everything and be able to look back and forth. So my concentration, I'll start answering a question and it's the wrong question or in the wrong spot. So for me, it's just very confusing how I approach it.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's the structure for me personally, not necessarily, it's how I perceive it, how I think through things.
Yeah. Okay, we'll maybe try different. We're going to try something different today, I think. Anyone else want to share? That would help, just so I can sort of retool.
Yeah, so I feel like our group is, I feel like we're getting it. But sometimes it's hard, I feel like we're getting it, we're getting there. And so we're excited to see where we go.
Yeah.
And then I also feel like it's repetition, right? Like using the tool multiple times to really focus on the goals.
Yeah. And I mean, I agree. It's a long list of things. And so I think, and I'll show you again how we can approach it for a couple of issues. But I guess what I'd like to do is just go through the strategies again, and then walk through a couple of scenarios. And sometimes there's conceptual overlap, and that's just like we're sort of their systems, and they're not going to be perfect. But it's sort of the best way to sort of make them as close to what you might implement as possible. But so with that being, the first time, like typically we start with either population management or habitat management. We're either like manipulating the population or the system. So starting with population management, like maintaining and enhancing genetic diversity is nothing new, right? Sort of we do population supplementation, we do captive breeding, we do translocations, things are like we do these things to improve genetic diversity. Establishing and maintaining, and I'm talking just generally how we use these strategies, and then like more specifically, we'll talk about the climate approaches. Establishing and maintaining connectivity between populations, right? So corridors like Yellowstone to Yukon, like this is something, or land bridges, these are things that we have been working on for a while. And then fostering metapopulations, thinking about source and sink dynamics. So shifts in the geographic range of a species in anticipation of future conditions, right? That's a newer one, right? Where we might be focusing on like the leading edge, right? Sort of like one part of a population over others. And again, removing barriers. So that's a little bit new. We haven't necessarily, I mean, I was trying to think of an example. I don't know that we've done that before. Interspecific and biotic interactions, like we control predators, we control prey, we provide supplemental food. Although that one doesn't come in that one. We manage disease dynamics. We do quite a bit for interspecific and biotic interactions already. Sustainable population size, like manipulating reproduction and survival, dispersal. I mean, we do everything from harvest to, yeah, I mean, quite a bit. But harvest and sort of excess protections from take are sort of the ones that really sort of stand out here. Oh, harvest is the next one. See, even I get confused sometimes, right? So harvest regulations is a particular one. So don't feel bad if you do. So, and you can ask me how many times I've looked at this list. It's a lot of times, but. And then plan for and reduce human disturbance and human wildlife conflict, right? So we do barriers to reduce disturbance. We do permits and sort of flagging, et cetera, to reduce human wildlife conflict. So nothing new. Oh, okay, so I'll stop there. Confusion on any of these, or question, not necessarily confusion, but anything that stands out or you want to talk about? Anyone? Come on, help me out.
I have a question if no one else wants to talk.
Okay.
One of my species is a spotted salamander. They don't go very far, but my understanding is they are, I'm not sure what the right word is, but they tend to go right back to where they were born.
Oh yeah.
So if they're not, I have a lot of wood frogs all over the place on the property. And I guess they compete wood frogs eat the salamander larvae, I believe, but if they're not on the property, what's the likelihood that you could attract them, or do you actually have to pick them up from somewhere else and bring them in?
Marta, do you want to do a salamander question?
Sure. Yeah, likely you would have to potentially move them in all of these cases where things tend to return to where they hatched and originally developed. There's always going to be a little bit of variation in that, right? There's always going to be some that wander a little farther. So there is the potential, if you have good habitat, to attract them. There's also the potential if their natal habitat, so a location, so where they would otherwise return to, if it's bad. So if that goes away for whatever reason, even though with salamanders, they tend not to move very far, a lot of that research is kind of done looking at the average, and you have these long tails where even if most don't move very far, there will be some, and it's going to depend on that intervening habitat matrix. So getting at that connectivity, even if it's connectivity not between existing populations, but connectivity between currently occupied habitat and potentially new suitable habitat. So a lot of these amphibians and like turtles and some other reptiles, we think about using kind of a patchwork of like vernal pools and things like that. So if those exist on the landscape, sometimes they'll kind of use those to sort of hop over. So it can be a mix. If it's good habitat and you're close to current breeding areas, you may get some movement in there.
Okay. And then one note that I went back, and I was supposed to have the wildlife adaptation menu up while I was reviewing it. So strategy 5 is directed more at sensitive, threatened, endangered species. And then 6 is ones where you might expect population increases and are trying to sort of reduce the population size, sort of generally. There was some time like where we were like lumping and splitting, but going back, so if that's helpful at all. Anything else on population management? Okay, so let's talk about a couple examples. And I gave you part of the information, right? So for deer, we want a socially acceptable population goal, right? So that there's hunting opportunity, vehicle collisions are not an issue, forests are still growing, and then we still have birds in the forest. With warmer winters and less snow cover, right? We have increased survival. So I'm looking at the really short 4-pager on the wildlife menu, but what could you do to meet your management goals here? So this is a climate. This is a species responding favorably to climate change, but causing other issues that limit your ability to meet your management goals. Let's hear from someone new. Come on. I can be patient. Andrew's getting a kick out of this. Come on. Oh, Kathy took the bait. Oh, I can't hear you, Kathy. Look at Kathy's dedication. Come on. Not yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
I can, yep. And then Brian will help you out in a moment too. Go ahead, Kathy.
Well, I was just going to say you can increase the number of permits that you give to reduce the population. It seems, is that what you were looking for?
Yep. And then where do you see that on the menu? What?
I think it's, I can't remember what number it is. It's on your
Yep.
previous page, number 6, was it?
Yep.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay, Brian. It unmuted for a moment. There you go, Brian. Oh, now you're still muted though. Still muted.
Unmuted?
Yep.
All right. I guess I have 2 reactions. One, I mean, the list you had before was everything, right? It was everything. And when we get down here to white-tailed deer, I'm going farther than you are, which is my problem with this all along, is I'm throwing other things in. You know, in southern Michigan, we're going to have increased Ph.D. We're having diseases that are actually could potentially reduce the survival of these animals. Hunting is a limited, frankly, our hunters are unable, we can't adjust. We've got all the dials turned all the way, is what our deer people say. So that's not going to help us with this kind of thing. So we're going to have to then go outside of those things to reduce the population if we want positive forest and ecosystem effects and positive safety effects.
And that's exactly why adaptation is locally dependent, right? So a strategy might not be available to you. It might be available in Minnesota, but not in Michigan. You might be dealing with EHD now, but in 3 years, it might not be an issue. Right, so it is fluid. There's no one right answer. It really depends on your local context.
Okay.
So given that, is there anything else are you concerned about or is there anything else you might do that's out of the box?
Well, there's habitat management to reduce the habitat suitability for deer if we have
Yes,
that possibility.
exactly. Yep.
So I'll stop there, see if someone else has their hand up. Unless you have another
Sharon?
question for me.
Yeah, no, that's good. Sharon?
Yeah, so we're supposed to be choosing one of the 7 categories, but then applying what we know from our local experience and expertise on how that, how to put that on the ground. So in terms of adjusting harvest regulations, New Jersey has a lot of deer, and we have, almost unlimited, harvest in a lot of our zones. But one thing we can do is maybe start opening it up to commercial hunting, which will be a whole nother thing. It's still adjusting harvest regulations, but it's kind of taking it up a notch. Or doing community-based deer management where they hire sharpshooters where hunting's not doing the problem. Things like that we can start doing. Or ordinances for, human wildlife conflict, people feeding deer in their backyards. Having regulations to do that. So there are things we can still use those broad goals or strategies and kind of apply it and just think outside the box that way.
Yep. Yeah. And again, and winter induced mortality is very much an issue in the Great Lakes, but maybe you won't see much of a change in like the Northeast, right? So that's been a signal of increased mortality in this region. So I'll just show you, I have a couple more examples. Right, 6.2, adjust regulations to decrease the population size. Plan for disturbance, right? So you might have to increase depredation permits. You might have to increase the number of sharpshooters to manage around agricultural areas. And then manage extant and emerging diseases. That one you can either do by, for moose and deer, they're reducing suitability of habitat for deer and increasing suitability of habitat for moose. You might be more, you might change densities. There are many things you could do on that. So those are just a few that I picked, but it would vary. Yes, Andrew.
Thinking outside the box, because I'm not educated in all this, New York State is also looking into letting people hunt and sell deer meat again. And I know it's a big controversy. The other thing is, coming from an agroforestry perspective, they're actually doing research in that a lot of these invasive species, plants that we're trying to get rid of, are high in protein. And so I'm thinking some of the, like I have European buckthorn, supposed to be high in protein. Is it possible to manage what we call invasive species? Because I am an invasive species by the definition, and utilize them to some kind of advantage.
Yes, and so we'll get to some of the decision context later of what might lead you, but this is really interesting to hear like the Northeast folks talking about deer. It's a little different than the Great Lakes experience. Let's do one more on population management. Timber rattlesnake, and these are real examples. So generally the goal is to increase the population size and the number of units. Extreme rainfall has been an issue, creating flooding of the hibernacula and increased humidity, which has led to direct mortality or increased disease of snake fungal disease. I added a little context for you in that there is inbreeding depression and habitat fragmentation going on. So what might you do? And you could pick from like population or habitat management. I picked a bunch on the population side here. What might you do here? Let's hear from a different person. Trying to get you all comfortable with it. Sarah, thank you.
From a population standpoint, you could look at managing the predators of the rattlesnakes. So the mammals, the coyotes, and foxes and things like that, that would maybe decreasing those populations to allow these rattlesnakes to reestablish themselves.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And what strategy would that be? Do you know? Do you have it in front of you? Do you know the number?
I think that's strategy 4. Is that right?
Let's see. Yep, 4-3. Just trying to get everyone comfortable. Yes, like Steve, you got applause from Stephen. Anyone else? One more idea. Someone else. Come on, Sharon.
You wanted somebody else, but nobody else is doing it.
Go ahead, Sharon.
What we've done is we create wildlife corridors to remove the barriers, especially under highways. And we make sure that they're conducive for snakes and turtles and things, as well as some of the mammals.
Yep, so making sure they can move. Yep.
Yeah, so that would be number 2.
Yep. Connecting subpopulations, 2-3. So would you like to see what I wrote? Genetic rescue, right? Sort of like, you know, restoring genetic diversity in inbred populations, which was not all of them were really genetically compromised. Some were, so you can do some exchange. Extant and emerging diseases. Although this one, you know, there's only so much you can do. Like you can't necessarily manage the humidity in the hibernacula. There was some a little bit of treatment, but it's an area where you can make progress. Obviously, we had a couple other good ideas. Illegal take was another one that you could manage here, right? Because people go out and kill rattlesnakes. So that was another idea. But like connecting subpopulations, also very good. Awesome. Okay, let's move on to habitat management. So food, water, cover, right? Elements of habitat, but sort of calling them out separately as being important. We manipulate these things all of the time, either from sort of how we manage forests to providing supplemental sources of all of those things. A new one is thinking about it relative to future conditions, so future forests, not necessarily the forests that are going to be drought, or future grasslands that are going to be tolerant to a range of drought and flooding conditions. Right, so thinking about that, or food that will be available in a different location in the future. The big one that we always hear about is sort of large protected areas are important. That is still the case, right? And that's a very big strategy that we will continue to talk about, as well as thinking about areas outside of the protected area. So private lands, working lands, what can be done on those to protect wildlife or provide wildlife habitat. Oh. What about those? How are those feel comfortable? So. Hillary, oh, thumbs up. Okay. Are the habitat ones more comfortable than population ones? Yes, I see. Generally, that's typically what we do a little bit more of. Okay, here's an example. Maybe how many? We have a few Fish and Wildlife Service folks in here, right? So, Horicon. The management goal is primarily nesting for redheads, it's waterfowl, right? But then also public access for recreation. They've dealt with extreme rainfall and flooding with loss of access and loss of nesting habitat. So the question is, what could be done to meet the management goals? Any Fish and Wildlife Service folks want to try this one out? I'm trying, Stephen. Do you have any tips? Come on.
I can take a stab, even though I'm
Yay.
not Fish and Wildlife.
Okay, Melissa, thank you.
I used to be Fish and Wildlife.
That we'll take it.
With nesting waterfowl and geese, I mean, you can do artificial artificial nesting habitat. They make islands and boxes and all sorts of stuff like that.
Platforms. Yes, that's a good one. I like it. And that, you know, for black terns, they've shown, right, because they sort of like can lose complete reproductive success, and they behaviorally will use those platforms. And so you can respond to climate. It's one of my favorite examples. Great one. One more, someone. We just have one more example after this, and then I will leave you alone.
I don't know how to raise my hand.
Go ahead, Kathy.
So how about promoting number 11, promoting wildlife habitat conservation outside of protected areas, getting local farmers to help with the process of nesting?
Yep, that's a good one. I'll tell you. So I'll show you what I put, and I'll tell you why I picked that one. But I picked it for a different reason. I thought the nesting platforms was a really great one that should have been included. Accommodate the altered hydrology. So people on refuges use water control structures. So oftentimes you're putting in higher capacity water control structures or additional water control structures to get the water off the land. But then where does it go? Right. So Horicon happens to be there's a state park near it, but then there's a lot of ag lands around it. And so paying for ecosystem services, so paying for those lands to be flooded, right? So working, that's the way to potentially, Kathy, sort of implement your idea of is actually paying for that, for them to absorb some of that flood water. And then redesigning infrastructure. So the access, right? So the roads that you have. So thinking about, can you reroute them for public access, or can you elevate them so that you still meet that goal as well? So remembering that there were multiple goals for that one. Okay, one more. So let's do grassland. So we're sort of kind of crossing systems. Henslow sparrow. So goal is to increase the population size. There's research showing that temperature and precipitation and change in habitat quality are causing declines in nest success, and habitat fragmentation is being a really compounding factor affecting it. So what might you do for Henslow sparrow? Any grassland folks on the call? Sharon?
Yeah, I'm a grassland folk.
Okay.
There are a couple things that we would probably do. One, I think Henslows can also be a high salt marsh species. We're a coastal state. So one of the things we would do would be to restore high marsh habitat. And with that, we use dredge spoils and kind of put it on low marsh and try to accommodate for sea level rise. And then the other one would be to promote wildlife habitat conservation on lands outside of protected areas, incentive programs for landowners to grow hay and do delayed mowing and things like that to kind of keep the habitat on the ground as long as possible.
Yep, great. So yeah, some really great ones. So the last one was, sort of some either 13.4 somewhere in that arena, and then managing I'm just looking back, or 11.5, depending on sort of how you do it. And then your idea of sort of how you restore it was great, and sort of thinking about relative to sea level rise. So really great ones. Yeah, so I was looking at, probably 9.2. Identify grass species that will tolerate future precipitation, timber change, and also meet nesting requirements. Yeah, so all great. Oh, NRC, yes. So with that, so you might want to manage for species diversity and complexity so that you have, and 9.2 is very good. Let's see, 9.2, yeah, anticipation of future conditions. Yeah, so 8.1 or 9.2, you want to think, you want vegetation height to provide cover, protect from predation. And so you want to think about drought conditions or flood conditions. Large intact protected areas are really important. So that's how they buffer the effects of climate, is they do well in large intact protected areas. So the more you can do that, the better. And then manage public or private ag lands for compatible wildlife use. So again, a range of options here depending on your local context. So thank you for humoring me. I appreciate it. It makes these always a little bit more entertaining for me, and I hope it helps you with navigating the menu and sort of seeing all the options available to you. A couple things to just make sure that we talked about, a couple of other strategies. Intentionally choosing to take no action, right? You can make that decision. You can sort of to say, I want to focus on something else. I don't have the money. This is not likely to work for whatever reason, but intentionally, right? As I sort of emphasize, strategic. And then engaging human communities and wildlife conservation. And then we have that in like human wildlife conflict and then the other strategies, but taking it a step further and more on the education and engagement approaches. And that came out of our meetings with resource managers as being two important ones. So just talking about decision-making for a moment, you might want to go and take a little nap like this one, but right there, sort of fundamental options that you have, and we've been talking about these for a few years in different ways, and that's why I have different words behind them. So in case you see them, you see the concept is similar. You can either say, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, like we'll have the same goal, but you're focusing on your historic system. So improving your defenses in the short term with a focus on the historic system. So resistance, you might have heard about this a few different ways. Preparing for change, you're accommodating some level of change, but typically you're still orienting on the historic system. Sometimes talk about this in terms of resilience or acceptance. And then directing the change, intentionally accommodating and focusing on a future system. And so facilitation, transpiration, response, different words have talked about these concepts. Everything okay? You see? Yeah, okay. So a couple considerations to think about. You should really, if you review your statutory requirements to identify your fundamental objective. Sometimes you can't, like you have to maintain that historic system. That is what you are mandated by law to do. So that's always the first recommendation. There's only so much time and money. You're already doing this. Triage will continue. This is just another element of triage. We were talking about public values, like so commercial harvest of deer, right? Public values and your organizational risk tolerance should be considered, right? Again, because there's risk of failure, there's risk of maladaptation, there's risk that it's not acceptable to the public. So consider these. Resistance might be effective in the short term, but long term might cost you more. But again, you can make that decision. It's just informed. And again, you all are very important, right? So local context is important. Your knowledge is important to identify those strategies that are appropriate for your site, for your species or population of interest. I think that's you might have some novel ideas. So don't sort of, again, some things might be standard par for the course, but we're applying them differently. And some things might be novel and sort of keep that out of the box thinking going. It's been great. And then I was trying to sort of find a great quote that sort of says, you know, it's our responsibility, right? Sort of we're working in the public trust, but sort of it's like, you know, of course, it's going to be a Leopold quote if you're sort of from the northern Great Lakes states, but right, sharpen the tools and make them cut the right way. So trying to figure out what those tools are, using them, implementing them. is what's most important. And there's still a lot of research to be done on sort of adaptation and like which tools will help you get to your goal more effectively for the least amount of money. So we're still working on it. But again, there's a large onus on all of us to sort of move forward. And that's it for me. So questions. So I made you all interact for a while, but so now you can get me back somehow. Kathy.
How does this actually look in the workbook? If we have a goal, can we have 5 or 6 or whatever different adaptation strategies?
Steve.
Approaches? I mean, how do we put this together?
Yeah, so I would recommend watching Patricia's lecture from yesterday. She showed some screenshots about how step 4 actually works in the workbook, where you're selecting which adaptation menus you want to scan through, and you can select strategies and approaches that make the most sense for your specific objectives, management objectives, and then you're adding as many as you like. This is, it's a brainstorming canvas for you.
Okay, so we can add multiple ones for each. Yeah, okay.
I'll just jump in here too. So you can start with, let's say, your first management objective. Think about what adaptation tactic you would use for that objective. And then you start filling out your tactic and the benefits and drawbacks and, work through the adaptation workbook. And it gives you an opportunity to show exactly which management objective that adaptation tactic is designed for. And you can make it apply to that first objective, or you can make it apply to multiple objectives.
Thank you.
Other wildlife questions or adaptation menu? Are you a little bit more comfortable with it now? Oh, Andrew's not saying yeah. Andrew's still a little bit. Margaret, no. A little bit, yeah. And I think the important thing is sort of you all were clearly identifying sort of the ideas, right? And it's okay, it might take a moment to sort of like match it back to the strategy, but thinking about those ideas. So it could go either way. You can start at the menu and sort of come up with ideas, or you can have your ideas and sort of crosswalk and to see like how they fit into a broader picture of adaptation. So. Anything else? You can always reach out if you have any other questions. Yeah. Steve and Patricia, turn it back over to you. Oh, sure. Each state's wildlife action plan may be a good resource. Yep.
I have a question.
Oh, sure.
Am I the only private person who's doing this right now? Because as a private person, I'm coming from a completely different perspective. It seems like I don't have constraints other than what my wife will allow me to do, as a partner. So yeah, I'm coming about from if they build it, they will come habitat, not necessarily trying to save something that's here now, because the only constant I see is change. And so I'm more directing the change in a way that will be more productive for the most amount of wildlife. Picking and I picked a few because I had to focus on wildlife. But well, I mean, I seem to be coming at it from a different perspective from everybody else here on the group.
Kathy?
No, you aren't. We're a small nonprofit organization and we're doing the same thing. We realized that climate change was going to change our forests, our habitat for our wildlife, and we want to be ahead of the ball, you know, and we have no constraints except raising the funds to do the work we need to do, because there are no funds coming to us unless we write grants or our members contribute.
Anything else? Well, again, it's been fun. I really appreciate you all diving in and sort of the case studies. And yeah, again, like I said, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions.
We know you just heard about this step yesterday from Patricia. So many of you probably haven't cracked the cover on this step in the workbook yet. So hopefully this is starting to paint a clearer picture of what that looks like, how to move through the menu from general to specific. So thank you, Olivia, for actually, you know, forcing folks to pick and choose some ideas in the menu. You have free reign here. And so please feel free to use all the instructors as sounding boards, backstops, whatever you like. We're probably not going to tell you that things are right or wrong, but we will ask you to provide details. How would you do this? Where would you do it? You know, when would you do it? Those sorts of tactical level details are really what's going to add the local flavor and really make your ideas feel concrete, like something that could actually be implemented. So that's what we're working for. Thank you to Olivia. I appreciate you taking the time to give us a deeper tour today. And we'll send this recording around after the fact today. Patricia's going to send out a newsletter here with some other updates and reminders, recording of Monday's lecture and Olivia's presentation here. So thanks, everyone.